Okay, good afternoon, everybody.
Sure. I just want to make sure.
Welcome to our seminar entitled The History of High-End Loudspeaker Design. My name is Mike Wexberg. I'm one of the VPs of the LA and Orange County Audio Society. I welcome you here today. Our moderator for this discussion is Robert Harley. He's been the editor-in-chief of the Absolute Sound since 2001 and is the author of The Complete Guide to High-End Audio, now in its 4th edition. He is also the editor of and a key contributor to the book that's the basis for this discussion, The Absolute Sound's Illustrated History of High-End Audio, Volume 1, Loudspeakers. Before becoming a full-time audio writer in 1989, Robert worked as a recording engineer, CD mastering engineer, and he taught a college degree program in recording engineering. So he has a very interesting panel to work with him on this discussion. So I'd like to introduce to you Robert Harley.
Well, thanks for coming to the show. This is kind of a new type of seminar. We've never done anything like this. And it's the outgrowth of our work on a book. We set out to create the definitive history of the high-end audio industry. No one had ever told the stories behind the people who created the products that we all enjoy in our homes. So we thought we'd interview the founding fathers of the high-end audio industry and create profiles of their companies. And it soon became apparent that this was way too much to put in one book. So we decided to split it into 3 volumes. And the first volume is of the Illustrated History of High-End Audio is on loudspeakers. So 4 of the gentlemen on the panel are featured in the book. So we thought, well, let's put together a panel and have them talk about the history of high-end loudspeakers. So I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves and give a little bit of background about what you do and how you got into loudspeaker design. Let's start with Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Kevin Vakes from Harman. I'm manager of product development for our luxury audio brands, which are Revel, Mark Levinson, Lexicon, and JBL Synthesis. And I got started like most everybody in this industry, at least in our age group, as a hobbyist and loving music and wanting to enjoy music more by it sounding better. And that meant DIY stuff at first, and then I went to school focusing on that aspect of engineering, and opened a HiFi store, a high-end store in Massachusetts, which is still one of our dealers. That was back in 1975. Somewhat after the earth cooled, as someone referred to earlier. And then started a little speaker company called Simdex with very limited funding to really do very good research. And then we started a company called Mirage in Canada. And then after Peter Snell's untimely death, and I'd been the first Snell dealer from about 1976. I then became chief engineer at Snell, and then came to Harman to start Revel in 1995.
Richard Vanderstein Audio. Again, same as Kevin said, it started out as a hobby, and also do it yourself also just because of trying to get something that worked for the amount of money I had at the time. Started Vanderstein Audio in '77, was actually working on the stuff, the designs from like '72, and started Vanderstein Audio in '77, and kind of boring, but it's still Vanderstein Audio.
Okay. Well, I like to say I got your beat because I was born in stereo.
The thing's not working.
I'll talk English. I like to joke that I was born in stereo because I'm actually an identical twin and a mirror twin. And my brother is left-handed, I'm right-handed, so we're born as a stereo pair. My parents are glad quadraphonic wasn't around in those days. I've always been interested in audio. Early, pre-teens, got interested in music, and both of us just decided this is what we want to do. So all through school and then university, I did physics because I wanted to learn about acoustics, sound and acoustics, and then did research before joining T.H.E, then Infinity, and now Pioneer and T.H.E. I'm like the rest of us. We're so boring because we've never done anything else. I'm not saying you're.
Thank you, Andy. My name is Albert von Schweigert, and I built a Heathkit speaker system in 1957 when I was 12 years old. My dad was in the military and worked for the State Department for a while, so I was raised in Germany. So we had this big old Grundig console, and telling my dad, well, it doesn't sound too much like live music. Let's get something better. So my father goes to the PX, gets these catalogs, and he says, hey, there's a company in the US making kits called Heathkits. So we bought a 15-watt tube amp kit and a big old speaker box. It was made by University Sound. It had 15-inch coaxial driver that you assembled yourself. You'd put the coaxial driver in the center and you'd solder up your crossover board. Very interesting cabinet. Came knocked down. It was 3/8-inch plywood with zero bracing. Had one blanket of 1-inch thick fiberglass that you'd glue to the back wall, and it had a big hole in the front baffle. So we fired this up saying, boy, we're going to have the greatest sound now. It was the worst sounding speaker I've ever heard in my entire life. I was 12 years old and could tell it was awful. I was taking piano and violin lessons, so I told my dad, I said, well, we've gone from bad to worse. And my dad says, well, let's fix it. And so he looks in there and he says, well, heck, there's nothing in here. So I went and got a pillow, we stuffed it in the port. Hey, some of the boom went away. The cellular horn is just screaming. It was probably 3 dB hotter than the mid-range. So I said, Mom, bring me some cotton balls. So we're stuffing cotton in the cellular horn openings. And all of a sudden, the boom and sizzle was gone, and we could hear the piano's mid-range. My dad said, my goodness, these people sold unfinished kits. These are for tinkerers. So my dad wrote a letter to Heathkit and said, my son's 12 years old, and he's in advanced studies, and he's found all kinds of bugs in your speaker kit. And my dad just sent a 5-page letter to revolutionize their company, right, and make a better kit. Never heard from him again. What's a 12-year-old boy knowing? Anyway, right? So anyway, like the other guys here, great music fan. My mom wanted me to be a doctor, so all of a sudden we moved to the United States. I got to get drafted. I'm thinking, hey, I'm not going to Vietnam. I don't believe in it. I'm a flower child. So I went to college for 12 years to avoid the draft. How many credits do I have? Probably enough for 3 degrees, but I don't know because I never graduated. One of the colleges I hung out with for about 3 years was California Institute of Technology, and a man there changed my life. His name was Dick, Dr. Richard C. Heiser, and I was in the lab with some other students who were screwing around building a 6-inch two-way, and this guy comes in and he listens, to it. We were playing I don't remember, open reel Tandberg or something through it, and he said, "Kids, that's god awful. What is that noise that thing's making?" And he says, "Have you measured it?" And we said, "Of course, we designed it by measurements." And he said, well, show me your measurements. So we show him, static, sine wave tone generator things. And he said, well, you got some transient issues here. He says, we have a Nicolette and we have an Ivy fast Fourier transform machine. You guys know how to use it? And we said, no, that's why we didn't use it. So we do an impulse response. This thing's a mess. It's pure garbage, right? So anyway, Dr. Heiser changed my life. He actually put me on the right path. And I've been studying speaker design now for probably almost 50 years. I have a collection of almost 200 books on, speakers and acoustics and electromechanical engineering. I was a consultant to a lot of companies. I started out as Dr. Oscar Heil's research assistant. ESS Labs hired me as a QC engineer because they had a 25% failure rate. You ever heard of that, a 25% failure rate? So they brought me on to try to get the failure rate down. I got it down to 3%, but it took 2 years. So one day in the lunchroom, Dr. Heil grabs me and says, well, my last research guy quit on me, got married. He said, that's the end of him. So he says, come on up to the lab tomorrow. So I go in there, and he's building this crazy thing called the Transar. It's a bunch of these big Lexan plates with carbon fiber rods that push this thing up and down. And I said, Dr. Heil, you have a single motor at the bottom. This whole thing's just going to vibrate and flop. I said, you've got to put another motor at the top. And he said, hey, you're my assistant. You're not designing this stuff. And I said, unless you push-pull it, this thing's not going to work right. So I ended up in my spare time building a push-pull version of the Transar. And then I made a three-way AMT, which went into production right before ESS collapsed. They had been building two-ways for many years. After that, I went to KSC Industries, and I became a driver designer. I had a guy from Taiwan who actually showed me a little bit more than what I'd learned at ESS concerning dome tweeters and mid-range drivers and whatnot. So I designed probably over 100 projects for 30 or 40 companies, including Matthew Polk's company, Polk. I designed the drivers for Ken Cantor at T.H.E. We did stuff for Klipsch after, Paul Klipsch had decided, well, his heirs were going to go into, I can't remember if Paul was dead at the time or not, but so we started building home theater drivers in Taiwan, and so I got into that, and then in the 90s I met Anthony Gramani, who invited me to join Lucasfilm and do some T.H.E engineering. So I did that for a while, and then I got tired of the corporate thing, making 50 grand a year and working 80-hour weeks. So I said, well, I want to turn that around. I want to make, some money and not work 16 hours a day. So I started my own company. Well, now I work 100-hour weeks. I haven't been to sleep yet. I've been up all night setting up 3 rooms. So I make half as much as I used to, and I work twice as hard. But guess what? It's worth it because of the passion. And that's why we're all here, right? That's it.
Incidentally, I've known Albert for a long time. I owned his Vortex screen loudspeaker from 1981 to 1989. So we go way back. One of the themes that emerged in the book as we interviewed the founding fathers of the high-end speaker industry is that very few of them said, I'm going to start a speaker company. Virtually all of them were hobbyists who couldn't find something on the market to buy that they wanted to own. And so they made it themselves. And a good example is Arnie Nudell of Infinity. He was a laser physicist working at Litton Industries. He was 29 years old, and he loved live symphonic music. And he couldn't find a loudspeaker that reproduced the bass and the scale and the dynamics of live orchestral music. And he worked with servos in his job. So he designed a servo woofer and mated it to an electrostatic panel. And he built this Frankenstein thing in his garage. And it sounded so good, he took it to a local retailer who heard it and said, if you build these, I can sell more of these than you can possibly build. And Arnie said, well, it's going to cost as much as the Volkswagen, which in 1968 was $2,000. And the dealer said, I can still sell more than you can build. So Arnie built 6 pair of them, gave them to the dealer, and the dealer sold them instantly. So Arnie quit his job, left his career that he'd studied for and just graduated from college with a master's degree in physics, and started Infinity in his garage. And in the book we have a photo of that garage with partially built servostatics in it. And so that story is repeated throughout the book. Jim Winey of Magnapan Richard, Kevin started out as a hobbyist. So it really shows that the industry was created by passionate people who wanted something better, that they didn't say, hey, let's start a business. Speakers are as good as anything. They were really driven by that passion. I can't help showing you guys this photo from the book. I don't know if you can see it. I brought a computer with me to project some of the images, but they didn't have the right adapter. This is Richard Vandersteen loading the first Model 2 into the back of his Pinto. This is before he had shipping cartons. And the top photo, you can see Model 2's under construction, and there's a washing machine in the background in his garage.
Turbocharged Pinto.
And anyone who knows Richard won't be surprised that he had built the turbo himself and put the turbo on his.
I have something in common with Arnie. I was a laser physicist as well. Oh, laser physicist.
How did you say lazy?
Lazy physicist.
Richard built his own airplane, so he knows a lot about mechanical engineering, I'll tell you that.
So it was really a great discovery and learning process putting together this book, and it was really gratifying. And so I thought I'd get some of the top loudspeaker designers and get their views on what were the most iconic designs and legendary products in the history of speakers. Because in putting this book together, we had to make our own decisions and choose which companies to cover, which products were the most iconic, and we really hashed it out. But that's kind of a set of one person's opinion or a small group of opinions. So why don't we start with Kevin? What loudspeaker designs throughout history do you think were the most significant and influenced the industry?
I'd start with acoustic research for making speakers that were far more true to life sounding and based on scientific principles as being a really good start. And then keeping it to very few, I also think of T.H.E and the T.H.E 104 and 105, and that Laurie used FFTs at a very early time where that was incredibly cutting edge. And so, another whole layer of scientific approach and leading to really excellent results for those speakers. And then I think of Peter Snell, who was decades ahead of his time in his thinking, where he put together real freedom from diffraction and also dealt with room boundaries that Allison had only done in a very incomplete fashion, because Allison only looked at the mid-range and the woofer independently rather than what you would need to do for the whole thing, full range, and Peter did a great job of that too.
Incidentally, Acoustic Research owned a third of the loudspeaker market for many years in the 1960s. And here's a great photo of Ed Vilcher in the white shirt there, setting up one of his famous demonstrations where he compared the sound of the AR3 loudspeaker with a string quartet. So the listeners didn't know if the players were playing or just pretending to play, and he switched back and forth. And this is one of the most iconic photos, I think, in the history of loudspeaker design. And Ed Vilcher's daughter gave us this photo for the book. And you mentioned Raymond Cook in the 105. That's Raymond Cook in an anechoic chamber testing the 105. Cool. Richard?
Well, when it comes to history, I learned a lot when I read your book because I really wasn't part of the scene. When I was in the Air Force, I ran into the quad ESL, Peter Walker's, and determined that would be my reference for mid-range, and went through all this live versus stuff over many years, trying to recreate things that we were recording. And so I'd have to say for the biggest influence on me would have been the quad, the original one. And back then it was mono. And someone here mentioned the FFT. We were just starting in business with very, very little capital. And I bought a Genrad 2512 in 1977. It was $26,000. And my wife at that time was buying her clothes and things at a store called Next to New. It was used stuff. And I said, man, I've got to have this thing to know what I'm doing. And she says, her name's Enika, by the way. She says, well, if that's what you need, that's okay. So, largest influence would be the quad. Strongest support would be my wife.
As Richard said, it always ends up as Richard said in these things. But yeah, Quad ESL for me, Peter Walker. Just a seminal study on how to engineer a speaker from start to finish with whole new technology and bring it to the market. Something that never existed before anywhere close to that quality level, and really set a standard that is even difficult to surpass these days. And it's certainly one of my references still when it comes to what a speaker should be able to do. And again, with what T.H.E were doing in the early days with the FFTs, you said about the GenMad, T.H.E, I think they spent £100,000 on their first Fourier analyzer to start that whole project. So it's Raymond Cook, particularly Laurie Finchen. He did most of the actual engineering for most of the history of T.H.E. People like Flo Toole. I'm thinking more in terms of the engineering background to producing speakers rather than the engineers designing the speakers themselves, but laying the groundwork for what we could do in engineering speakers. Those were the kind of people that influenced me. Baranek, I've got a book, just a very interesting quote. This book was 1954, so before I was even born. I'm not looking at you. So this is one of the best textbooks on acoustical engineering, and but in the chapter 8, loudspeaker enclosures are the subject of more controversy than any other item connected with modern high fidelity music reproduction. It goes on to say, a large part of the difficulty of selecting a loudspeaker in its enclosure arises from the fact that the acoustic factors involved in the reproduction of speech and music are not understood. Listeners will rank differently 4 apparently identical loudspeakers placed in 4 identical enclosures. It has been remarked that if one selects his own components, builds his own enclosure, and is convinced he has made a wise choice of design, then his own loudspeaker sounds better to him than does anyone else's loudspeaker. In this case, the frequency response to the loudspeaker seems to play only a minor part in forming a person's opinion. 1954. We should all remember that.
I get over the years, 38 years now, customers call me up and say, hey, I did this and I did that. And it really, really improved the sound of the speakers a lot. You ought to incorporate these into your design. And I said, well, one thing about doing it yourself and putting all that money and work into it, you're gonna like it. But it was amazing how many of them, within 3 to 6 months, would call up sheepishly asking if I could put them back the way they were.
So, Albert, what key landmark designs do you think were the most significant? Which products?
Well, I'm 20 years older than anybody on this panel, so I was born in the 40s and was raised in the 50s. And we were all going to movie theaters. And a gentleman named Harry F. Olson had designed the first horn speaker that really sounded good, and it was done for RCA. And he had 2 15s, and he had a central horn, and he had a crank on this horn where he could pull the horn back and forth. And he and his technicians were out in the audience, and they were using Maurice Chevalier's movies where he's tap dancing, or somebody else, maybe it was Gene Kelly, and they're listening to tap dancing, and then they're doing this, and they're doing this, and the guy's cranking the horn physically back and forth to tune it to the 215 so that you could hear the treble transients in phase with the correct timing, so that you'd hear the tap dancing between a unified array of sound rather than 2 woofers and a tweeter that weren't synchronized. So when I heard all that and was reading about that in the magazines of the 50s, I thought, man, this guy, Harry F. Olson, he's the bomb. So I started following him. He has 100 patents in the field of electroacoustical and mechanical engineering. He designed microphones for RCA and speakers. This guy invented more things than every other designer put together. He was an absolute genius. If you read through these 100 patents, you can't believe one guy did it. It's like unbelievable. He developed low distortion drivers, horns that didn't go into resonance, time alignment, better circuit designs to integrate the drivers, better cabinets. I mean, the guy had it all, and this was in the 50s. So that's my guy, Harry F. Olson. No one's ever even heard of him. He's one of those unknown guys because he was the face behind RCA. You know, and you saw the RCA living dog, you know, and all that stuff. Well, who were the guys behind that? Who did the work? Harry was the guy. So he's who I nominate. Peter Walker actually builds probably, you know, when he was alive. I go with everybody else. The quad, when I heard it in the mid-range, within 2 or 3 seconds, you know that speaker is correct. No cabinet, no crossovers, fast transient response, low distortion. Of course, they don't rock. I mean, we all build speakers that rock, but Peter designed a speaker that, you know, could show you how to go, you know, how to take it. You know, what are you trying to achieve if you make a bigger device that will put out wider bandwidth? So
Peter just listened to Radio 4. He didn't care about rocking out.
Oh, and the other thing is Peter is famous for saying he never listens to music when he designs the speakers. He listens to test tones. He was famous for quoting it. Never listen to music. Some guy came in there and interviewed him. I was reading Wireless World back in the 50s and 60s, and they said, well, what's your favorite music? And he said, well, and he played the guy Pink Noise or some kind of tone burst, and he said, that's my favorite music. I don't know if it was a joke or what, you know, because the Brits, they're a little bit, you know, different. they have a very droll sense of humor, right? So whether Peter Walker was kidding or whether he was serious, I don't know. Maybe Andy would know.
You had to sit down with him with whiskey by the fireplace.
And this is Peter Walker, and that's a Quad 57. A lot of loudspeaker designers cite the Quad as the great example of as the reference, particularly in the mid-range. But talking about RCA, a lot of the speaker development in the 1930s took place at RCA and Bell Labs, and it was driven by motion picture sound, which is brand new at the time. It was driven by radio, and it was driven by the electrically recorded phonograph, which was also new at the time. So loudspeaker development really entered full-scale commercial production starting in the late 30s, and it really boomed in the 1940s with companies like Altec and then JBL. And the modern tone loudspeaker can be traced back to this device. This is the prototype from 1921 from Kellogg and Rice. And this is on display in a museum. And then the first commercial application of this device was the radiola. So this is the first audio system that you could buy in 1926. So it really started in research laboratories, and then interestingly, it moved from research laboratories and physicists to hobbyists working in garages. So that was an interesting trend, that it moved from the laboratory to the garage.
That Kellogg and Rice had a really crisp top end.
So I'd like to ask the panel about what technological breakthroughs they consider the most important, or major trends, like it could be materials technology or computer-aided design, or the influence of cabinets, or any of those types of large-scale trends. Why are loudspeakers today so much better than they were even 20 years ago? Let's start with Kevin.
I'd start with moving coil loudspeakers, not just a self-serving thing, but I think that they're still the moving coil loudspeakers are still the preferred mechanism of reproduction, and they've just improved gradually, particularly with the Klippel system as a step where we were able to get much lower distortion and can really be below the threshold of audibility through much of the bandwidth, which is pretty cool. And that's a relatively recent change. Going back farther, you look at Teal and Small developing the math. That's the sort of thing that I'm sure all of us used to pore over those seminal papers that they did, because that was almost all you had to to grasp at early on were those papers and what came out of them. And it's still right, and it's still the basis of what we do at low frequencies, at the lower range of each transducer. Then I'd say real anechoic chambers were a very important thing because you have to really, really know what you've got, and that's the only way to get an accurate measurement to this day that includes all the information and doesn't wipe some of it out as part of its pseudo-anechoic process. And as Robert mentioned, CAD filter design. Peter Shook was the first person that I knew of, who was then at the Canadian NRC, who created a program that actually worked. You'd wait for it to run all night long, and then it would usually crash, but if it didn't, you actually got an answer and it actually made some sense. And of course, now those programs are incredibly accurate, where you can even factor in all of the off-axis responses. The directivity is part of the original design, which I believe is essential.
Like Kevin said, moving coil drivers certainly have the bulk of the market, and that's what I believe in. But probably the biggest advancement is being able to develop diaphragms that are truly pistonic at all frequencies. I think this is where we'll see huge improvements as far as distortion is concerned. And of course, that's materials based. And the challenge then is to bring that down into lower price points, especially if you want it pistonic enough to be able to use first order filters. That's been a real challenge.
What they said. In the sense that I think what we're able to do now is implement a lot of the research like Allison, Baranek, Dick Small were doing to understand what you can engineer into a loudspeaker, but now with techniques where you can implement a lot of that research very quickly and easily and iterate very much faster than you used to be able to do. So it's the fundamental groundwork that these people laid down. Dick Small for the mathematics of the low-end response, along with Neville Teal. Interestingly, Dick came to work at T.H.E for 4 years, and it was with him and Laurie Fincham and Floyd Toole doing all the research on listening tests. We all knew each other, all worked together. And at one time they actually thought of forming a consultancy, just like Baranek. You had Bolt, Baranek and Newman, one of the most influential acoustic consultant engineers. Those guys thought they'd put something together, and they were going to call it Small Tool Fincham, until Fincham kind of objected to that. I'm trying to confirm your ideas about British humor.
And they wouldn't have had any clash of ego.
Oh, no ego. No.
Well, I see we've got some competition next door here. That is Pink Floyd, The Wall. Well, I think one of the walls that we've had in loudspeaker design is the fact that, as Dr. Heiser used to tell me, Dick would say in between cigarette puffs, he smoked 4 packs a day, bad for his health. But he'd say, well, you know what, Albert, we don't really know what to measure. He said, you know, you can measure distortion, you can measure frequency response, but all that does is show you if you have a level, you know, amount of pressure at each frequency between all of the drivers. He said, what if that pressure is all distortion? You can have a flat frequency response, but what if each tone that consists of that response is distorted? And so I went home and I thought about that. And the next day I said, well, Dick, I got it. What if the king said to his highwayman, hey, I'm going to have a big ball, and all of these potholes, you have to fix them overnight because I'm going to have all the royal carriages coming in to the castle. And so if you guys don't get these holes in the road fixed, I'm going to have you beheaded. So the guy said, well, there's no way we can fix all these potholes tonight in the dark. And the king says, well, you better figure it out. So these guys went and mixed up some kind of stuff, you know, who knows what it was. It was probably mud, right? And they filled up all of the holes, and then they, you know, the whole highway coming up to the hotel, they went and they brushed it off, and it looked really good. It was flat, looked really nice. Well, the carriages started coming, and all of a sudden they go into the potholes because there's nothing but mud in here. So the thing is the quality of the energy is very important. By its very nature, a loudspeaker is a resonant system. And you're trying to fill up all these holes by putting more resonance in those holes in order to get flat response. Well, that's the same thing as putting mud in the pothole. It's not. It doesn't hold water. It doesn't work right. So when Richard Heiser invented time delay spectrometry in 1967, this is a few years before I met him. Time delay spectrometry is a way of using a fast Fourier transform in a room. You put pulses, and basically it gates the microphone on and off so that you can see what's coming from the speaker, and it's basically turning the mic off to all of the echoes that come. You know, you program it. It's quite an elaborate series of devices that he put together. And the one thing that I found that was just amazingly useful, and the other guys use it too, they probably use it more than I do, they just haven't mentioned this. But we look at the resonance over time decay. It's called the cumulative spectral decay, or the waterfall plot. Okay, what you're going to do is get your first pulse, and it will show you how flat the system is. But then as the energy starts to die down, you'll see that certain frequencies are storing energy, and other parts of the frequency spectrum are shedding the energy faster because of less resonance. So if you look at the CSD, as we abbreviate it to, you can see what part of the system is going into resonance and what's storing energy. But what makes a speaker sound muddy could be energy storage in the suspension, or as Richard aptly said, the cones can be flexing, you know, the non-pistonic, so they're bending. You have bending wave mode distortions. And when those things are moving around, you know, the cones are vibrating and all that, it's releasing energy after the initial pulse. And cabinet walls, when I was telling you about the speaker kit that I built, can you imagine they sent us 3/8-inch thick plywood, 24 inches, you know, cubic in dimension, 24 by 24 by 24 with no bracing? Well, that cabinet probably stored energy for 2 or 3 seconds. So that is a live microphone. So you can imagine, you hear one musical, you know, fractile, as Bob wrote in a book many years ago, and he said that there could be millions of fractals of energy in one piano note. You know, you go to a Bosendorfer or Steinway piano, and you play one note, and you hear not one note like on a little toy piano that's a piece of tin in a plastic body, but you're listening to the wooden, you know, cabinet, you know, resonating with this incredible, big, giant, beautiful, warm tone. you're hearing those strings resonating, and there are multiple windings of strings, right? They're not solid core, they have windings around them, they're wound strings. And these are stretched over a big brass, plate on each end. And so you can hear probably hundreds of thousands of micro fine details in that one note. But if you put it into an average loudspeaker system, and I mean average, something you get at Best Buys, right? You can't hear all of those fractals of energy because of the fact that the system is swamping that original set of sounds with its own overlay of distortion and coloration and energy storage. So that's what all these gentlemen and I are trying to do. We're trying to get rid of stored energy in these resonant systems. And we all have our unique approaches. But what's interesting is this, and they'll probably all agree with me, we're all converging. Have you noticed that the speakers get better every decade? They're all converging towards low distortion, wide bandwidth, and wide dispersion designs, where you can have some controlled directivity, but that's maybe where we all disagree is, hey, how are we going to kick the sound into the room? But I think that's one of the biggest developments that we all use is this, the cumulative spectral decay. And Dr. Richard C. Heiser, my mentor, helped develop all that stuff. So.
And also cone loudspeakers are sounding much more like electrostatics and ribbons. All the qualities that people prized about electrostats and ribbons for decades that cone loudspeakers fell behind on. Cone loudspeakers today have the speed and the transparency of planars.
Without resonances.
Yeah, that's right.
Have you ever seen the waterfall plot of a stretched chimpanzee?
Yeah.
Oh my God, the whole thing, John Atkinson calls it chaotic behavior.
Speaking of Richard
You
Heiser,
can't hear it.
Richard Heiser is one of my heroes. He said, quote, one of the worst kept secrets in audio engineering is that what we measure does not correlate with what we hear.
Exactly.
And he also created a thing called the Heiser box. So it's a little box about this big. It had an input and an output, and you could put it on a test bench and measure it, and it had infinite bandwidth, zero distortion, zero phase shift. It was just like a straight piece of wire. It measured perfectly. And then if you put music through it and listened to it, the music was so distorted that it was unintelligible. And he created this box to show that the fallacy of thinking if something measures perfectly, it sounds good. And the trick behind the Heiser box was a circuit in there that detected the steady state of sine waves. And if it detected sine waves on a test bench, it just connected the input to the output. So it was a straight wire. But if it detected music, the dynamic, it had a relay that chopped up the signal. But it really drove home a good point about the fallacy of just looking at measurements.
Yeah, that's like benchmark testing of computers, where they recognize what the test sequence is and then artificially change the computer system. But I think the point about measurement techniques is that they have got better and better and better. So in the early days, the measurement techniques that were available to people were very limited. So correlating that to what you heard was very difficult. We're getting much better at doing that. Floyd's done lots of work on comparing listening tests to measurements and getting more of a feel for that in a very scientific way. And the tools available to measure have got cheap enough that, well, I like to say cheap enough that anyone can get the wrong answer now. You still have to have the ability to know what that measurement really is, and are you testing the system or are you testing the test system? And very often, though, people, if you haven't had the ability to measure properly and you just get one of these machines, you'll believe the measurements erroneously, and you'll go down the wrong track, which leads to people to believe measurements are very limited in their capability. Knowing what to measure is the real key. And no, not everything that we hear can be measured. We don't perfectly correlate what we can measure to what we hear, but we're getting better at doing that. And but it still comes down to the end. You, after all the measurements, you're still going to sit down and listen to it and tweak it.
Another point Richard Heiser made.
One
Sorry.
of the, oh, excuse me.
No, go ahead.
The last 4 products that we brought to the marketplace were done totally by measurements and my ability to interpret those measurements. And the first time I ever listened to them was at the show.
I've done that.
And in all cases, they've been wild successes. We do have the ability to measure things, but it's still up to the guy that puts the right importance on what you're measuring and how you interpret those measurements. Test equipment now is so available, so economical, like you said. And, but it still comes up to, okay, what matters most? And that comes from years of experience of looking at that and understanding. And very few changes from that time. But again, it's in the interpretation of what the tests show you.
I certainly agree. We have a suite of measurements that tell you most everything about how it's going to sound, not 100%. I think that the limitation right now is at very high frequencies, that we don't have it nailed completely with measurements. But over most of the range, we really do. And we've got tens of thousands of double-blind listening tests to back that up, so it's not really just opinion.
So let's turn the attention to the future of loudspeakers. They've gotten so much better in the last 20 years, certainly. I mean, they've been becoming progressively better, but they seem to have taken a step function maybe 20 years ago. Maybe that's just my experience, how long I've been in the industry. But so what's the future of loudspeakers? What will speakers be like 10 or 20 or 30 years from now?
I think it'll be mostly materials, the application of modern materials and trying to do it in a more cost-effective way. I think that we're going to be listening to cones and domes for many more years. At least that's how I see it.
I think the biggest changes will be our ability to do effective DSP processing, both for the loudspeaker and the other giant problem, the room acoustics at low frequencies.
I think the future of loudspeakers seems to be headphones. Unfortunately. No, I think the future is, you just touched on it, the room. We all design, and you mentioned about the directional characteristics of the loudspeakers. That's crucial to how it's going to interact with the room. And we keep making the mistake of, we make better and better speakers and people put them in horrible rooms. How do you fix that? Do you do one-dimensional DSP processing to try and fix the room, or do you do what you should be doing, fixing the room? So how do we move forward and optimize the speakers for properly playing back in the room? And are there techniques that are coming along that can do more with the room acoustics in an acceptable way? There's certainly more materials becoming available that would be acceptable in the home to treat room acoustics, that even an interior designer would love. And then techniques for controlling the wave launch and the return of that wave in the room that would help control low frequencies. And I think that's, if we want to make further advances beyond just what the loudspeaker itself can do, but we're talking about how to get better sound when we listen to it in the room, then we have to be doing more with the room.
Well, we've since the early 90s in our top products had built into the speaker provisions to deal with low frequency issues to a degree in our products, and it doesn't require running your whole signal through digital processing, because a big part of our industry is still being driven by people who prefer analog over digital. It's actually growing, in my opinion. So being able to do it and not have to, I mean, ultimately, if we get digital to where most people like it, you could just take a well-designed box, put medium quality drivers in it, protect it maybe with a cap so that you're not, put them in a chamber, hit them with a pulse, burn an EEPROM stick it in the amplifier and ship it. So now your quality control, your final result, it's way less demanding on the driver, and out the door they go. I mean, and I think we will see that. I don't know that will be what is accepted at the extreme of our hobby.
It doesn't sound very fun.
Well, it's bound to be more profitable than tweaking on them in an anechoic chamber. But
So no one sees any major breakthroughs in technology. Everyone thinks we'll still be listening to moving coil drivers for the
I don't
foreseeable
know about
future.
that. Has anybody ever read any books by William Gibson? He is the guy that predicted the internet back in the 80s. William Gibson wrote Mona Lisa Overdrive. In his books, he has about 10 or 12 books out. He has these internet cowboys that jack into the the ether, and what they're doing is they put electrodes on their temples, and those trodes give them the ability to go into electronic form through the internet and then visit anywhere they want to visit. So my idea of the future, I mean, I don't know if this is where technology is headed, probably not. But wouldn't it be cool if you could put on these electrodes and all of a sudden, and it's nothing to do with headphones, because if you listen to headphones, you've got left and right channels, you don't get a stage out here. But can you imagine putting some electrodes on and putting it into some kind of a special device, and you're surrounded by an orchestra and it sounds real? Well, it would have to come from psychoacoustic engineering, The room is a huge thing. Like Andy's saying, you can make the greatest speaker in the world, but you put it in an average room and it sounds like crap. So the room's got to be addressed. So do you have speakers that address the room automatically? A lot of weird things to think about. I like records like Richard a lot more than digital, because I'm from the 78, what can I say? But digital is going to be here, unfortunately. And with digital comes the ability to model and build anything that you want to build. Whether it's electrodes on your temple or speakers that correct themselves, for the room conditions, for everybody, everywhere, not just a single channel, DSP solution, but I mean a sound field where you can move about in the sound field and it sounds like you're, anywhere you want to be, in front of the orchestra, behind the orchestra, whatever. But nobody knows where it's headed, and that's what's great about it. The crystal ball's a little foggy there. We can't quite see into it. But I think we're all headed in the same direction.
In Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, he points out the fact that when we listen to live music, what's happening is electrical and chemical activity in our brain. And if we can simulate that, if we can create those patterns in our brains through computers or external devices, it would be absolutely indistinguishable from the original event. So that's an interesting idea, but that's way off in the future. We're out of time, so I'd like to thank the panelists and also mention that if anyone's interested in a copy of the Illustrated History of High-End Audio, these four gentlemen will be at our booth for the next 15 minutes or so and would be happy to sign a copy to you. So let's give a thanks to our panelists.
And I would like to say I agree with everything Albert said except for the best mic comment.
so this whole thing was so you could sell books.